Welcome to the Member Engagement Show, the podcast for association professionals, brought to you by Higher Logic. I'm your host, Kelly Whalen, and in each episode, we'll talk to guests whose expertise will help you gain new members, boost retention, and deepen member involvement, all goals that can transform your organization. I invite you to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode, and visit us at higherlogic.com/podcast to catch the best of past episodes. Now, let's start the show.
Welcome back to the Member Engagement Show. Today, I'm pleased to have Erin Fuller on the show. Erin is the Global Head of Association Solutions for MCI Group in Geneva, Switzerland, and also serves as the Chief Strategy Officer for MCI USA. She leads a global team in growing community, engagement, and investment in associations around the world. I'm thrilled to talk to her today about the forces shaping associations in the year ahead. So welcome, Erin.
Thanks so much for having me, Kelly. It's great to be here. And just to thank you for that kind introduction. I started out as the CEO in several associations and then led an association management company, which we sold to MCI about 11 years ago. And now I'm really thrilled to be the first American in global leadership at MCI. We have 2,000 talents spread across 62 offices in 34 countries. So in 2025, I visited 15. We'll see how many I'm able to spend time with this coming year. But there's a lot of really interesting work that we do that really leverages our global footprint. One of those I know we want to talk about a little bit today is our Association Engagement Index, and we're about to prepare our 10-year retrospective on that. We have a lot of data on association customers' kind of emotional connection to the organization and that relationship, which I think is really interesting. But for me, I just love the association space so much. I feel like associations are the original platforms for trust. And before all the algorithms that I'm sure we're going to talk about today, they're really sustained by community. And I think that that's what is the kind of secret sauce that makes a lot of us really excited to work in this space.
Yeah, I also am obviously a big fan of associations. That's how I worked with them for a long time and ended up at Higher Logic, because I just think there's such a unique, like you said, a community aspect that you don't always find in other organizations, although I think it can also benefit a lot of corporate organizations too. I also love that we're going to talk about the Association Engagement Index today. As you know, Higher Logic does an association member experience report, so we love to look at the data of what we're seeing in terms of what drives member engagement and what trends associations can look out for to try to improve the impact they're having for their members and the way that they keep those members as members and bring in new members too. So I know for one of my first questions, I want to ask you about, there's obviously a shift impacting associations in kind of generational turnover. So the retirement of longstanding association members and that effort to bring in younger generations like Gen Z. I wonder if you can talk about some of the data MCI has collected on this and what you've seen from others.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I was talking to a group, I think a month or so ago, and saying, since I started my career 30 years ago, we've been talking about how, those younger members, why won't they join? And I always say, well, because they're young. And when you were 20 something, was everybody paying the dues for your professional organization, sending you to conferences? No, of course not. You're still figuring out if that initial job choice is a career choice. So we're seeing a lot of that, and that kind of settles over time. I will say, though, that over the past 10 years of our research, we have seen that both baby boomers and Gen X have had the strongest emotional connection to the organization. And that's as consistent 10, 11 years ago as we're seeing today. And so some of that can be driven by career stage, but some of it is driven by maybe different values or priorities held by those generations. I think that what we hear about Gen Z all the time is true, right? Digital first, values driven, the need for immediacy. And I think what's really interesting now that I have this global perspective on association engagement is that we see actually stronger Gen Z engagement outside of the US. So the Gen Z problem may actually be an American Gen Z problem. Some of that is because What we see in a lot of other countries is that there are apprentice-like programs, and that approach to apprenticeship means that people are probably more secure, employers are more secure, that these folks are really engaging in a career versus kind of a job to kind of try it out and see how it fits. And so there's probably more security in investing in association engagement for those early career talents. So this is an area, one of many, where the U.S. could potentially learn from our global colleagues in terms of our approach to how we onboard and train up younger talent. We also can't assume that Gen Z is going to grow into kind of these legacy models we have. I don't think that Gen Z is going to inherit our engagement models. We have to assume that they're going to design them. So we have to kind of leave the space for these younger members to do that. And some of that from our perspective is around co-creation. One of the pieces I really liked, I was at a recent conference around Gen Z and marketing, is that they want to be part of the process. And as the mom of two Gen Z people, I think a lot about what I see on TikTok. I'm not letting technology leave me behind. I'm a huge TikTok fan. And I think about kind of this get ready with me approach, right? And I think that in associations, there's a lot of pressure for us to present everything as it looks perfect, right? You walk into the ballroom and there's dramatic lighting and upbeat music playing, and you're kind of ready to see a show. I actually think that organizations that kind of pull that curtain, that give a back of the house or behind the scenes tour of some of the elements that go into association management, events really lend itself to that. But in general, I think that could really garner interest. I think that's a huge mind shift for a lot of us who were trained to no one needs to see anything until it's flawless. And that's a very, very different mind shift. But in addition, we're seeing the growth of micro credentials, more flexible volunteer models, and the impact of overall communications. All of those things are going to be that much more important. But that co-creation piece is really important because the expectations for a relationship with an association are just inherently different.
First of all, it's always so validating when someone is seeing some of the same trends that I'm seeing, because I'm kind of like, am I the only one reading these articles? And then we realize, no, we're all seeing similar things. So I love a lot of what you've called out about the incoming generations. And obviously not everyone in any generation is all the same, but I do see a lot of the same trends and shifts, like especially that the desire for a collaborative experience, that it's not just, you give me things and I passively accept them. Mm-hmm. It's, I want to be part of this thing and have this relationship. I also think, I love that you brought up TikTok, because my own TikTok, for me page, or the kind of feed of all of the things that I am shown by my algorithm, a lot of them are that discourse about what it's like to work in the world. Mm-hmm. So I think my algorithm has picked up that I did work in nonprofit, so they'll make little jokes about what it's like to work in a nonprofit. Right. And not always in a positive light. It's this space where people are they want transparency, they want authenticity, they want to be able to say, hey, this stuff about my job sucks. And that doesn't mean I hate my job. That just means there's stuff in every job that sucks. And I'm going to feel this relation and this way to figure out how to work in my job by connecting with others who do the same job and understand the challenges that I have. And I think associations are so well positioned for that. But like you said, some of them are holding on to really strongly that feeling that, we have to be perfect. We can't show the background, or we can't acknowledge some of the things that really suck about this work, or what have you. The other thing that I found really fascinating about what you were calling out about the difference in sort of the U.S. younger generations joining associations versus global, it struck me that there is often this culture of very individualism in the United States that is around kind of, you as an individual need to figure this out, figure out whatever it is, figure out buying a house, figure out going to college, figure out getting into your career. And the mentorship situation you talked about in the global environment feels like just such a natural fit for the association world, and the way that maybe associations could guide organizations in their industry and say, hey, like, it is worth it to invest in and try to build up these younger generations that are in your organization because A, they're going to be more likely to stay, B, they're going to be better at their job, and the association has a way to do that without putting unnecessary burden on the organization.
There's a difference between mentorship, which is incredibly important, and certainly as a company, we invest in that. We encourage our clients to do that. In apprenticeship, which is a much more formal training program in a specific discipline. I will say in the US, it's interesting. One of my clients is the Solid Waste Association of North America. And I'm really struck by the trades do a much better job of this, right? And if you think about it, it's a job where you have to learn A before you're able to do B. There's a little bit of a system about it. There's also an assumption that a lot of those skills or processes may not change for 2, 5, 10, 30 years, right? Unclogging a drain now is not very different than unclogging a drain 50 years ago, right? So there's not, and so that piece is interesting to kind of consider. And I think that in general, when we look at how, especially associations that are either professional societies for people in trades or trade associations, their approach to standards development, professional education, et cetera, is a little bit more structured. And I would say there's a definite pathway versus professional development. I see sometimes for people in professional services, et cetera, where this apprenticeship approach isn't as strong. But I do think those two things are different.
Yeah, thank you for making that distinction, because I think that like uncovers really important differences between like then how to create that environment where that can thrive. And as you were talking, it struck me some of the trends we're seeing in professional development, education, continuing education kind of things are around that, embracing that model that you described being more associated with trades, where there is a path. There's sort of this is not just one-off pieces of education. This is not like a monthly webinar that has nothing to do with the last monthly webinar. It's what is the path that someone can follow across the educational experience they might have with the association. I think also when you talked about micro-credentials, it struck me that that is aligning not just with the generational shift, but the shift in the way that working works, where you do, especially I think in professional associations and like services and office work type jobs, your role is often shifting. At least that's been my experience, that in marketing, for example, my role is always shifting. There's always changes happening in what works in marketing or what types of marketing I'm responsible for in my role. And as such, a more flexible credential program is helpful to me because tomorrow I might have to learn a totally new thing. It's not like the last 30 years of marketing have been the same. It's like the last year of marketing has been a totally different experience than the year before. So I think those organizations that embrace that flexibility, the micro-credentialing setup, or maybe stacked credentialing where they can plug in or pull out things based on what is shifting and not have to totally scrap everything they've done because it was so rigidly stuck together, I think we'll be in a better position to thrive as in the way that working works today.
Yeah. And, it's interesting kind of going back to that TikTok piece you mentioned, and then I'll talk about the stacking as well. But I was thinking too, I also watch a lot of talent being very candid about their work experience, right? Because I think that that's really important for me to understand kind of the reality, and a great reminder to put myself back in the shoes of someone who maybe feels like they have less agency within an organization, and how we can address some of those things. I think that I used to go down the hall and close the door and vent to my colleague. And now I'm seeing people who don't have colleagues down the hall who maybe are using social media for that. I don't know how I feel about that, right? I mean, part of me is like, good for you. Like, this whole salary transparency thing is so interesting for someone of my generation to look at. And there's always been such a taboo about talking about compensation, right? And that's also a US construct in some ways. Some countries and cultures are far more transparent about that. And I can completely appreciate why transparency breaks down any number of barriers and areas of inequity, et cetera. It's still very hard for me to, process. I admit that. So I think it's interesting to see that how will that age over time. I think that's going to be something that'll be interesting. And there'll be a lot of conference content about maybe that video, that where I lit my workplace on fire 10 years ago is not maybe the path to career success, or maybe it is. Maybe it's now becomes really valued. So I think those are things that are evolving, and we'll see. The stackable piece in terms of professional development is really interesting. I am a strong believer and member of the cult of Peloton. I'm one of those people who got one right before COVID. It certainly has kept me sane. And I'm very, very proud of my 307-week streak right now. And what's interesting there is you stack your classes. So you can stack 10. And so for me, I know I want to do strength training 3 days a week. I know I want to do cardio, whatever, yoga, et cetera. And I stack it all at the beginning of the week, right? And that changes, right? Oh, I'm traveling, so I want to do a workout that doesn't need the same equipment or machine or et cetera. So I have that flexibility to approach it. And it's so helpful and so human in that approach. So I think, Kelly, what you were saying about the ability to customize your pathway in terms of learning is that same thing. And we're seeing some organizations break that up, chop things up, as you were saying. Now with AI, it's so easy to create such hyper customized educational content. I think that throughout my career, we've been very precious about curriculum design and the need to have, I've been part of so many processes of getting the Blue Ribbon Commission together to create the pathway and then all the testing you need to do. And it's so interesting to me now of the power of taking 2 webinar conversations and a couple white papers and say, how would you structure this into 5, 10, 30, 60-minute education bites for people in that approach? I think that I was at a conference where they said the kids that are entering kindergarten probably next year, certainly at some time during elementary school, it would not be surprising to have an absolutely customized curriculum for each student, right? We know you learn this way. We know your areas of intelligence or strength are here and your areas of development are here. And so we're going to have more independent reading for you, but maybe more group work on arithmetic. Like, you think about that. And as a parent, that makes total sense, right? And that is not how we're able to teach large classes today. When we think about customization, a lot of that is on the marketing side, but I actually think on the learning side, that's where there's a huge area of development. Lastly, to harken back to one of the Gen Z things we were talking about, what's really interesting about Gen Z is there's a sub-cohort of Gen Z called Gen Q. And those are the kids that did a lot of distance learning during quarantine. And that subset, still too early, but there's some emerging data, deep distrust of distance learning, of virtual learning, because a lot of them carry really negative experiences, right? Keeping their camera off, lying in bed, not really learning during that time. There was obviously a huge correlation on mental health challenges for a lot of kids during that period of distance learning. And certainly as a parent to kids that age, I can completely understand that. So I think that will be really interesting, is that a lot of associations are leaning more on the digital or virtual side. But what I see with the Gen Zs, my roommates that are Gen Z and their friends, they will almost always pick a live opportunity if they have high value to it versus virtual, right? My son wants to go to a job interview in person versus do one on a screen. And I am curious to see how that impacts what we do with associations moving forward as well.
All of that is fascinating. And picking up on what you closed out with, I think it's really interesting to me because I recognize that associations often have limited resources. And so you might want to be able to say, oh, should we do virtual or should we do in person? And I really, personally, I think it's going to be both for a long time. Yeah, and that you're going to have to, you're going to have to invest in both pretty heavily because of what you said. There's going to be people who do want to do virtual. Like, I don't live near my job. I don't live near some of the hubs of where there would be marketing events hosted. So sometimes it's hard for me to go to an in-person conference. That said, I do also have an appetite to go network with people in my area. So when there is something happening in my area, I do want to go to it. I feel like we sort of naturally led into one of my next questions, which was just talking about the forces shaping associations. So I'm going to officially lead us into that. And kind of ask you about any other forces you see as shaping associations. I think we already started talking about AI, and it's my understanding that MCI has cultivated an internal culture of robust AI usage. So if you have tips for walking listeners through how that impacts your own organization's success in that area, I think that's super helpful.
Sure. Let's start with the AI, and then we can move into kind of then the overall kind of trends for associations. I'm very proud. MCI is a frontier firm with Microsoft. So we made a decision really early on in 2023 that we were really going to be not just a digital first company, but specifically really invest in our tools available to our talents and the training for our talents. So last year, we mandated that everybody was credentialed in generative AI. We'll move into a mandate around agentic AI this year. And so that means that we have 2,000 people that really are using Copilot, because we are a Microsoft shop, in an incredibly robust and effective and efficient way. It's really exciting to see. And to the point where now it's so natural. I've said this to someone. I don't know how to go back and do my job now without these tools. I really don't. And it hasn't been that long, but I did get my first license. I would say it makes me kind of a grandparent here, but I did get my license, my first paid license, I think, for chat was back in 23. And so we really did empower a handful of people in our company to go and explore different tools. We have a pretty open system. We want it to be legal and safe for our clients. So we have a process to approve other tools as well. We have AI champions globally, and then we have AI champions within each country. We have 18 in the US. I do AI office hours every other Friday for an hour, and we get 35 people. So in the US, we have 350 people. But 10% of the company show up to a completely unstructured hour to just talk about, what did you do that worked? What can you not figure out? There's no agenda. I usually go in with like 2 tidbits of, hey, have you tried this? I did this week. I'm very proud of it. But we fill up the entire time. Every time I wonder, will anybody show up? And every time it's, we max it out. So I think that people are really open to learning about it. We track the usage of AI within MCI. And to me, what's really interesting, I review Power BI tools, not what you're using it for, but within what app. Like, are you using it mostly on the web? Or are you using it within each element of the Microsoft suite? For instance, they're just trying to figure out how people are really using it and where we need to shore up training. So for instance, if I see that France is using Copilot within Excel 48% and we're at 20%, I wonder if we need to do some specific training around Excel in the US. But those are things that I think about. I am not seeing a huge generational or hierarchy divide with AI. So when I have these office hours where I see who's engaged, or when we do kind of some gamification occasionally on things, I am so impressed and inspired that there are people who are maybe in the final decade of their career, as many or more of those as people in the first decade of their career. What's great about AI, because it's language driven, is that it was so easy to show the impact of this with everybody, right? So for decades, we've told everybody, you need to learn to code or you're never going to succeed. And I just dodged learning how to code my entire career. And now, we don't have to. And so I think for people who have been afraid of, I'm not really a tech person because I don't know how to code, I don't have that language, which is important and valuable, and incredible respect for people who do that work. The ability to have AI be accessible to, like, I have, 3 sad vegetables and half a chicken breast in my fridge. What can I make for dinner? Like, those kind of things made AI immediately applicable to folks in a way that I don't know that we've seen with everything else. So I also think that for us, we really view AI as a multiplier. And so how do we keep our human talent focused on strategy is incredibly important. I don't think that AI is replacing expertise, but it's removing the overhead between questions and insight. And that, to me, is so everyone can get there faster. And I think that's really exciting. And so I'm very proud of, as a company, how we've approached that. And certainly the reason that we feel this pressure to be pretty far ahead, I would say, of others, not just in the association space, but I would say professional services firms in general, is because we then know we have to train the trainer, right? We have to then go to association boards, staff, et cetera, and be able to showcase how we've integrated these tools in a way that makes us efficient workers and also shows there's real value that MCI now can overlay as a result of our early investment in AI that our client partners, our association partners can really leverage. And so when we think about, we all talk so much about what's the AI impact on associations, and we've already talked about kind of this hyper personalization, but the ability to do that personalization at scale to, tailor the communications, volunteer pathways, the learning journey I mentioned, based on kind of aptitude and interest, and being able to base it on behavior, not assumptions, that to me is the real power of AI. And again, that's so rooted in human behavior. And I think that's where we lose people with AI a little bit. Oh, like the robots are coming for us and taking all our jobs, et cetera. But to me, what I really love is it does strip out some of the human bias. It's got its own bias there, which is, something to unpack. But I do think that the ability to take huge amounts of data and grab sentiment from it is, to me, the most interesting and exciting thing about it. I think the other piece is just what I call unlocking dormant knowledge. Associations are drowning. I mean, you guys know at Higher Logic, like drowning in information, right? Chats between board members 12 years ago, right? Like how to wring value out of that. But I can't tell you how many times, because I work with people in boardrooms, and for instance, a lot of associations have restricted funds. A lot of those restricted funds were created 25, 50, 100 years ago, right? Of somebody died and somebody gave a small amount of money that's now become a significant amount of money. If those funds are restricted in a certain way, the board can't ever access the principal, only the interest. Some associations are at a point where funding I'm going to just make something up, funding the award for amazing typing speed may have made a lot of sense in 1925, but in 2025, that's no longer relevant. We're not using typewriters anymore. So we'd love to unlock that principle to be able to apply it to tools that are more relevant today. And so the ability now for future governance structures to go back and be able to quickly access those conversations, the sentiment of the room, how was the vote, right? There's all of these kind of legal implications for that, but also kind of piecing together kind of the governance history of an organization as just one example of unlocking that. Certainly, we also know that, there's just archival articles, through journals, through a millennium. There's newsletter articles. I mean, journal articles actually have always been well indexed, but all of the other communications that we do with association folks have never been appropriately indexed. And so that ability to do kind of that search and analysis on steroids, I think is really exciting. And I think that using AI to look into the past is really interesting as kind of like someone who loves history, historical fiction, and actual history. I think it's very, very cool. As a globalist, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't talk about AI's ability to unlock global engagement. I get to see that in real time. My day often starts at 6 a.m. or 5 a.m. to accommodate a lot of different time zones around the world. The ability for real-time translation really lowers barriers. We have to pair that with appropriate cultural context and human review for sure. But having people who aren't native English speakers, for instance, and usually English is the language of business for most organizations, is a huge game changer. When we think about, it's so hard to get our global colleagues, global, of course, in the American context, meaning anybody outside of the US involved. Some of that I always say is, well, are you making them join a call at 3 a.m. and are you speaking a language that's their fourth language, right? So when we think through all of that and AI's ability to parse through some of that, or being able to fully catch up on meetings you do miss, right? So not just having notes from it, but being able to see the actual meeting, I think that's really great. And then finally, of course, operational efficiency, which I feel like has been talked about to death, but is really the foundation of this, right? I mean, the ability to move people, both volunteers and staff, through draft processes quickly, through review processes quickly. I think that those pieces are really powerful as well.
Absolutely. Once again, lots of things that you said were resonating with me as I was listening. I feel like anyone if anyone was watching the video recording of this, they just see my head nodding. And I think a few things I'm going to call out just because I think they're so key to a lot of what you were talking about. One is that organizational support for staff to advance their knowledge of AI. Higher Logic believes in that really strongly as well. And I think that has set our staff up for success. And in the same way, because we're invested in helping associations, us being able to learn how to use things means that then we're in a position to help associations that we work with, which is awesome. And I am not a super I don't think of myself as a super technical person. So occasionally I've had moments in the AI shift where I am kind of questioning myself and that imposter syndrome comes in and I'm like, I must be dumb. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not doing a good job with AI. And I think that until I go to, for example, a conference. I just went to a conference that Marketing Profs was hosting. And in one of the networking sessions, I was talking to another marketer, about a process where I used AI to help audit some of our content and score it based on a curriculum that I set of saying, hey, these are the things I want you to score based on. These are the ways that I want you to score it. And then it was able to go through 200 blog posts and score them for me instead of me looking at every single one manually. And the people around me heads turned to look at me and they were like, wait, how did you do that? What did you do? How did you set it up? And that's when I feel like it clicks for me that having that support in my organization to play with stuff like that has led to me trying to think of stuff like that.
Right.
And I think an important part of it that I felt like it was a thread through some of what you were saying, an important part of it is of being able to figure out how to apply AI in your organization's environment is understanding what you have and the processes you use to do things at your organization. So using a marketing example in an association space, I would say, like you said, you have all that past documentation of, oh, here's all of our conference sessions, here's all of our board meeting notes, here's all of our webinar recordings, knowing what you have back to, again, some organizations are hundreds of years old, knowing the things that you have that you could then have AI dig through for you or pull things out of is super valuable. And also documenting how you do things, I think, is becoming really valuable for AI, especially when you talk about agentic AI, because as I've gone from, just asking ChatGPT a question to trying to train custom GPTs and trying to set up ChatGPT projects and maybe trying to set up an agent in Glean, I've realized that I need to know, for example, for content marketing, well, how do I do my job? What are the steps that I take, checking SEO, keywords to see what we should talk about, looking back at past data research we have, looking at customer behavior, that kind of thing. I need to sort of write that down to see, well, where in that pathway could AI help me? Or could I train a piece of AI or an agent or something to do some of this for me if it knows what my process is, and then I could trust it more too. I think for me, that's been one of the light bulb moments too, of going from a space of, oh, I don't really always trust this to get it right, to, well, how do I build it or use it in such a way that I can trust it to get it right? Do I just need to give it some materials that I trust and say, pull from these, which again, associations would be ripe for. You could be absolutely pulling from all of your documentation and your articles and everything to pull information that you trust, as opposed to just asking ChatGPT to come up with something based on the internet.
Yeah, I think we're in a co-pilot environment. There are other environments for us because we are a European-based company. We have very, very, very high data protection standards to meet. And so that works really well for us. The nice thing about using Copilot is that it has access to our entire SharePoint. And you can toggle between work mode and web mode. If you're in work mode, if I'm in one of our clients, for our full service client, in one of their folders, it will automatically pull everything in. So if I say I have a call about ABC org in 10 minutes, it will go through my emails, my Teams chats, all of the documents that I have access to on my SharePoint to be able to pull that. So what you're describing kind of exists in that environment, which is incredibly helpful. You're also able to create agents within specific SharePoint folders. So you can create an agent just for that. There's definitely a lot there. But going back to your imposter syndrome thing, it's interesting, right? Because we're already seeing a gender gap in terms of AI use and comfort, which I'm displeased to see. So we're seeing anywhere from a 5 to 20% gap. Harvard Business Review reported about a 21% gap. I've seen other studies recently, not by HBR, that are saying that's shrinking a little bit. I believe AI, when we think about this kind of, and I am not one to lean into gender stereotypes, but as a woman who leads a company, but I will say that when we think about the language areas, that generally women have better, more robust skill sets in the use of language, the application of language, right? AI so supports that. And so I think it's so important that we are showing women in particular that this is a very accessible technology that, again, when we look into pathways where women are overconcentrated, marketing, human resources, right? Communications in general, event planning and design, right? These are all female dominated fields, and especially within associations. Associations are female dominated. There's a real opportunity for AI here. So I'll get off my soapbox there, but I would be remiss if I didn't lean into that. It's interesting. I've been doing a lot of keynote speaking about AI the past few years. And if you had told me 4 years ago that I would be speaking on topics that were related to technology, I would have said, Kelly, you're crazy, right? Like, I'm not a technologist at all. And so I really focus on the applications, right? I can't really, as I say to people all the time, I don't understand how electricity works either, but I know how to turn on a light. So I kind of just rely on, kind of the magic of this experience, and I don't get too bogged down into the how, but the what and the outputs and the way it can support my work, I think is really powerful. I do think that associations are behind. So you were talking about the conference you went to. I go to a lot of events. I am still surprised, even 6, 12, 18 months after the first time, of the number of hands in the room in terms of how people are using it in a very basic way, but not, to your point, in a more advanced analytical way. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think association members need to be shown how AI impacts them as volunteers, as members, but also as practitioners in their industry or profession. There's a real opportunity for associations to lean in here. We're seeing some do a great job of that. I think this is going to be potentially a really big divide for a lot of organizations and how they approach that.
I'll kind of close out on that topic by saying, even like beyond a gender difference, I think it's making sure, just like any other educational setup that you would have, recognizing that people are going to respond to different ways of talking about things. And I think, or learning about things. And I think sometimes what I struggled with, especially early on with AI, was the way that it was talked about, and kind of, it felt very tech bro-y in a way that it was not resonating with me. Right. I was kind of like, okay, this is one of those things where people are saying like, no, you just have to use it. And I'm kind of like, no, I want to see, what are you using it for? What is that could be anything. Like, people will have different hang-ups about maybe using it, or different questions about using it, or different areas that they get stuck. And I think being successful as an association training people in it will require, I think, going back to what we were saying about Gen Z, a level of kind of transparency that there's not like one specific way that you could use it, that it could be used in many ways, and kind of a behind the scenes look like, oh, hey, this is how I set up a ChatGPT project. And then I realized that I needed to fix the instructions because I wasn't getting the right output back.
That showing the process part that we talked about earlier is 100%. I often say that when I talk about AI, I say it's really just a series of me doing close-up magic for the audience, where I could show you, here's a graph AI did for me. And you're like, great, I can do a graph, right? So when you show people, so I can't tell you, I'm in front of 500, 1,000 people. I'm literally on screen showing me take a spreadsheet, dumping it in, and show, like, you have to show those steps so that people understand the speed of the output, because that is the piece that if you don't see the process, you don't appreciate that. If you don't see the process of having a dialogue back and forth with the AI support, you don't understand the ability to change it. A lot of people will say, oh, I asked it for something and it gave me garbage. And I think you already referenced this, right? The need to spend time training this support in a way that understands you, understands, kind of the intelligence you have, as well as the intelligence.
My chat GPT has started referencing what it termed. It came up with this term, quote unquote, Kelly core, where it's like it has been observing how I do things, and it started saying, oh, I can offer you suggestions that align with how you'd like to do things. That's
amazing. I love that. I think, and like, that's the piece where, again, people can get creeped out a little bit by that, right? But I think the other thing that I always say is that, in 24, the biggest use of AI was really kind of this, I'm going to call it operational efficiency piece. And in 25, we saw this shift where the biggest use was kind of companionship and therapy. And so people are starting to talk with this. The ability for us to merge those two things is really going to be, I think, a significant superpower. But I do think, again, showing that process, it's not, again, if you told me that a keynote would be like showing a very complex spreadsheet, which every association has, right? When you think about your typical event and you have everything from meal choice to session selection to continuing ed credits, et cetera, there's so much data there to mine, and the ability to kind of do that and see different trends, et cetera, not doing it manually is such a game changer for how we can move forward, kind of creating experiences and opportunities for engagement for association customers.
I do think talking about AI trends could be its own whole episode, but I want to steer us. I do really want to talk about non-dues revenue. So I'm going to shift into that and kind of flag it's just increasingly important for associations to diversify their revenue streams. And I think for a while now, non-dues revenue has been top of mind, but I wonder if you could share some trends or insights that you've seen in that area.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing with events specifically, right? And events are a global product, right? So, one of the things, and we might talk a little bit about the global piece more, but one of the things I remind associations all the time is in the US, you might have an association with 10,000 members and you have 2,000 people attend your event. Outside of the US, in Europe, for instance, you may have 10,000 people go to an event and only 1,000 to 2,000 are members, right? So there's always, kind of this flex there that's important. But what we're seeing is a shift to curated experiences. So smaller events with very, very specific audiences, and not just C-suite, right? That's kind of easy, but emerging professionals, right? People who are can be maybe influenced in terms of their buying or purchasing behavior earlier in their career. Also, a continued shift to year-round sponsor value. So, plastering somebody all over an event that only, especially in the US, only 20% of your members attend and see is not as valuable as having that year-round piece. We're also seeing, in terms of non-dues revenue, we're also seeing a huge growth of credentialing. Credentialing is the lead product in a lot of global markets. And so membership is a US and European construct, or North American and European construct. Membership has little value or relevance as a lead product in a lot of other markets. Credentialing, especially in areas where post-secondary education is inconsistent, having kind of a global or US standard of learning that you can shop to an employer is really valuable. And so seeing the credentialing and all of the things we already talked about in terms of micro-credentialing, digital badging, et cetera, that piece is a real opportunity, also an opportunity for sponsorship as well. We're also seeing a growth in corporate training, what I would call kind of white labeled experiences. So if we want to use the AI example we just had, the ability to go in, if you're a trade association, and go into ABC Corp and be able to deliver training to talent and be able to present that as ABC Corp's training, even if it's the association owned training, there's a real opportunity there. But I think that in general, with non-dues revenue, a lot of times associations, it will be reactive. It needs to be a strategic ecosystem, not patches. So we can't just say, oh, we have a gap here. What new thing can we create and get to the market quickly? It's not strategic. It doesn't work. You need to have kind of a consistent approach. Otherwise, your pricing is all over the place. The opportunities for investment can be really confusing. We have to create revenue as related to a product, not just a line item solution, because if it doesn't advance the mission, it's not strategic. And so I think that the most successful associations are the ones that view non-dues revenue not as a budget gap filler, but as a strategic growth opportunity. So a way to get maybe venture capital in that Let's launch this new pilot product. Let's make sure we price it appropriately, shifting associations away from taking a loss on new products, right? But making sure that there's margin there right from the start as an ability to continue investing in that area of training or that mode of teaching and educating.
Yeah, I think that mindset shift also helps associations shift to thinking about, instead of, what like new or different or totally disconnected sponsor thing can we offer, but instead, what do we do already that sponsors could help us bring in a little more money, or they could offset the cost so we don't have to charge members so much, or whatever it may be. And then I think you end up having a much more cohesive and program.
You have certain sponsors that are going to want their signage at the podium and, have a very transactional view of things. But I think a lot of companies, especially those that are in innovative areas, want to be venture partners with associations. I think back to when I was the CEO of the National Association of Women Business Owners, at this point, 20 years ago. And I was able to go to a large scale financial services provider and basically say, we want to launch a book series and here's our outlines, but we need capital to do this. And they loved it. They loved, very discreet branding. They were able to give it to their women clientele, right? So it was a way for them to kind of have a branded product. Again, this would not work today. The thought of print books feels very retro. But we were able to secure a very significant six-figure sponsorship from them for something that didn't even exist on a prospectus, right? But I wouldn't have gone to our other partners. I knew that this particular firm wanted to be innovative. They wanted their brand affiliated with first and new to the market and market exclusivity. And I think most associations have a sense of their partners who would be open to that, but we don't have necessarily that approach, or we don't have the CEO involved in those kind of pitches, which I would believe when you're creating something new and at scale, you would need to have kind of C-suite involvement in that.
Yeah, I think it helps too. I've worked at associations that, and granted this was a little while back, but that didn't have someone dedicated to the overall sponsorship or non-dues revenue efforts. It was more that everyone individually was kind of thinking about them. And I think that can be a miss depending on the organization, because that person, if there is someone thinking about it, then they are building relationships with the partners. They are bringing in the CEO or are briefing the CEO or executive director or whatever when they need to make that conversation successful. And I think sometimes that's what an organization needs sometimes to get their non-dues revenue program to mature.
We work with about 50 organizations. We have a team of people who do nothing but sell integrated media, right? So not just one thing, not just sponsorships or ads or other investment opportunities, but we want to sell kind of the whole portfolio. So I'm really lucky in that I have a team of 50 experts in this specific area to kind of ask about these opportunities. So we actually will be, I think, releasing some data this year about the trends we're seeing specifically around non-dues revenue, because it's such an area of interest. When MCI does content in terms of webinar post, this is the topic that blows up for people, right? Everybody's understanding and realizing that there needs to be something beyond the standard portfolio of membership, events, and then I would say pubs / continuing ed. There needs to be more nuance there.
Obviously, as the global head of association solutions for MCI, you also think about global trends and the ways that associations can expand into global markets. I know we've touched on a few things that relate to global markets so far, but I'm wondering if there's any other areas you recommend or tips you'd say people could focus on.
One of the biggest mindset shifts that I really encourage for US-based associations is they need to consciously dismantle this idea as the US is the default context. This is very, very hard for Americans. And it's interesting. I work for a company that's minority American, which I think every American should have that opportunity and that experience. It's been incredibly mind-shifting for me. Kelly, you and I talked about this, I think, in another conversation, but even things like using snowflakes when we talk about on our newsletter in the winter, when half of the world is experiencing a different climate and season at that time, right? So a lot of times we'll have coffee talks, right, that are scheduled usually US East Coast time, right, that is not, time for coffee. It's probably time for maybe some cognac for more of the world. That kind of language can be really limiting. It instantly makes somebody feel other or not part of the majority. And I already referenced this jokingly, but in the US, we're famous for using the terms international and global for anybody who's not American or maybe North American. And so those pieces, I think, are really important to really explore and unpack a little bit, because again, sometimes we believe we're like the only culture that from kindergarten on is taught like we are the best, right? I've asked people from other countries, like, are you guys taught that, like, you're number one or whatever? Like, no, and so we sometimes are also not open to appreciating that we don't actually have the best ways to do everything. I think that is, and I'm not trying to belittle my fellow US citizens here, but I mean, I do think that that's important to understand and be open-minded there. I think also that localization does not equal translation. So a lot of clients will come to us, we want to open up in Latin America. It's like, what does that mean? Like, just like Google Translate this curriculum and like put it up there. That's not the way, right? So an example I had used in another section of our conversation is that in the US, we lead as membership. North Americans have a strong affinity to join something. Like, joining is a big part. It's for centuries. Like, de Tocqueville wrote about Americans and this need to join stuff. That is not the same other places. And so even explaining to organizations, you have to lead with a product. Events, obviously, is one that works in a lot of markets. But as I mentioned, credentialing and really structured continuing education, those are the products you need to lead with. Well, if you're used to bringing people into your organization via membership and then selling to them, and then all of a sudden needing to sell a product first, that's a very different business model for an organization. So I think, what I say to a lot of associations will say, okay, we're ready to grow globally. Like, well, the globe's like a super big place, right? So understanding, like, what are your markets? Where is engineering or accounting growing the fastest? What kind of local partners do you already have? Do you have a board comprised of people that are from that geography or that country? Americans have this, we have a nasty habit also of saying Europe, like it's just like one place, right? And as someone who was in 4 European countries in November, right? You've got a different language, a very different culture. There's a huge difference between our Berlin office and our Geneva office, right? And the clients that they work with, even though those are border countries. And so even when people say, oh, we're ready to expand into Europe, I'm like, well, where in Europe, right? Like, what makes sense to you? Do you want to start with a small country? There's advantages there in terms of market penetration. It probably means that you may be more limited in terms of language, right? Is it worth the investment to translate into Dutch when that's not going to be as replicable in other geographies, right? So does Spain make, more of a better choice? But Spanish is very different than Mexican Spanish, is very different, than Spanish spoken in other Latin American countries. It's funny you bring that up. It immediately, core memory unlocked. I have a side of my family that has arguments about that, actually, about the different types of Spanish and what different family members speak. Yeah, no, I mean, it's right. Even within Spain, right? You have people who are like, I'm not Spanish, I'm Catalan, right? Like there's all of these nuances. There's no way that I could ever be smart enough or culturally competent enough to go in and make those decisions without a local market partner. So that's always my first thing is, who are you working with in country? You need someone who is on the local time zone. We are very digitally fluent, but for a lot of cultures, face-to-face or phone, our voice is still going to be the way that they want their answers given to them. So you can't rely just on your kind of normal customer services practices. So much of that is just kind of culturally nuanced, and it's harder than people think, and it takes longer because membership, that is a different call to action for people. Join this, you're part of a community, versus our education is better than, it's usually a pretty competitive landscape. And so establishing that brand, establishing the validity and the quality of that product is really a different orientation. And so those are all things that I appreciate my experience with the MCI so much for helping teach me that. And then having that reinforced when I go to our offices in Brazil or Brussels, and really seeing the real differences there in terms of how things operate, not worse, but different. We convene actually something called our Global Growth Workshop every year right before the ASAE conference. And we leverage the fact that a lot of our global colleagues are there, but we bring together about 50 CEOs of truly global organizations. And it is a really unique set of organizations that are really activating global markets. They definitely see things. They see how they market their products in the US differently as a result of the success they've had in other markets. It's really interesting. So I'm a huge raving fan and cheerleader for the opportunities associations have in developing new markets for their products and their communities, but it definitely is not as easy as just, translate.
Well, this conversation has been so helpful and far-reaching, so I really appreciate you sharing all of your knowledge and the insights that MCI has gathered in your own data. I wonder if, closing us out, you have either anything else that you would call out or any resources that you'd suggest for listeners if they want to dive deeper into anything.
Absolutely. Well, I'll go ahead and make sure you have kind of the data we've collected from the Association Engagement Index over time, because I think that's really great. What I would say is that this is such an exciting time to be able to really create new things and have them go to market so quickly. And so this ability to kind of combine a lot of things we talked about, synthesizing these huge volumes of information, leveraging our Gen Z members to co-create new products with us, making sure that we are mission aligned because that's the right thing to do. And that's also going to make sure that our early career members, kind of feel aligned and welcome. And making sure our non-dues revenue is also strategically aligned. Like all of those things play into each other. But at the end of the day, we came here to talk about membership. And, I will argue that that's one product of many. I think that the future favors associations that move from membership as a status to membership as a service. And so really making sure that our membership is personal, portable, and globally relevant, so that the brand really shines through is important, but also making sure that we understand that membership is an important service and product to our community of stakeholders, but there are a lot of other elements that may be more or equally important depending on kind of where they are and where they sit in an organization.
Well, thank you for coming on the show, Erin, and sharing all the information that you shared, and I look forward to seeing MCI's Association Index.
Thank you. What a great conversation, Kelly. I could talk to you all day. This was such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Sis.